So if you have a Bible with you, I'm going to ask you to turn. We're going to take a time now to look at some passage from God's Word, and we're going to talk about what it means, and why this matters, and what we should do about it. So if you turn to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, if you're using this Brown Pew Bible, it's on page 202. And when you found that, if you would stand together with me, I want to read this passage together. 1 Samuel, chapter 17, the big black numbers there are the chapter numbers. Let me read this. I'm going to kind of skip through because there's a lot here, so we're going to skip a little bit, but we'll try to get most of the story in here. Beginning at verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp near Ephes-dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied the hill on one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. Verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and his iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, the next section here is really just kind of setting up kind of bigger picture what's going on. Jesse has all these sons, and his 3 oldest sons are here fighting in the war. And we're kind of told the story of how David gets inserted into this story as Jesse sends him to kind of check on how his boys are doing with a little lunch. And so David shows up. He follows what his father's done. He shows up to the camp just as they're heading down to the battle lines in the morning. And so he follows down. He wants to see what's going on. And look at verse 23 now. He was running down to greet his brothers at the battle line. As he's talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from the lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Now what follows here, David starts to say, well, who's this guy? What's going on with this Goliath guy? Why is he up there? Why hasn't anything been done about him? And Saul hears that at least one guy in the camp is saying this stuff. He's like, well, I got to bring that guy in. He seems to be the only one who's not terrified right now. Jump down to verse 32. David comes in to meet Saul, and we read this. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "No, you won't. You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he's been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Now Saul tries to give David his armor. He's like, "You can't go out like that." So he tries to give him his armor and his sword, and David's like, "Man, this is too big. I'm not even used to this." He takes it off. He's like, "No, I can't wear this stuff. I just got to go with what I know." Verse 40, so he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and while with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David, and he looked over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. And he said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here today will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran over, stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the scabbard, and after he had killed him, cut off his head with the sword. And when the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. This is God's word. You may be seated. Let me pray for us once more and just commit this time in God's word to him. Spirit of God, we have already seen you move powerfully amongst us this morning. I'm asking you to just do it once again. As we come to your word now, we believe you have inspired these words to be written. We believe you have a purpose for each one gathered here today, and I'm asking you to accomplish that purpose in each one of us. You know exactly what it is. God, would you meet us? Would you speak to us? Open hearts and ears to hear and receive and be changed by this, just as you've changed me by this in this past week of preparation. And as I always ask now, eternal God, would you move and govern my tongue to speak your truth? Amen. When it comes to the strength or weakness of a relationship, communication is often said to be a key element in that. Yes, and yet along with learning stuff like trigger words or tone or body language, those are important, but one often neglected aspect of communication is not actually what you say at all, but how well you hear. And by implication with that, how well you understand what the other person is saying. And I think it's safe to say that over the years, men and women have both found this to be an equally challenging part of communication, regardless of which side you're coming from, because even when we do hear each other, very often we still find it so hard to understand what the other person is saying, understand it rightly. I don't know if you saw this a number of years ago. I saw it on YouTube, this hilarious kind of spoof ad for something called a manslater. Did you watch that ad? It seemed pretty cool. Basically, it's a device that helps either sex determine the code, basically, of what the other sex is speaking so you can understand what's being said. So, the husband, he's about to head out. He's like, "Hey, baby, I'm going to go play some golf. Is that okay?" And she'd say, "Yeah, that's fine." And he'd be like, "Okay, good." But then he would check the manslater and realize, "Okay, not fine. Don't go." And he'd be like, "Okay, good. You know what? I'm going to stay." So really helpful. I mean, I've never found one of these devices. I would love to have one. But regardless of that, to break the code, to understand each other, at least what we see is that we don't just need to hear each other, but we need to hear each other differently, right? Hear each other in a way that's going to bring understanding. Or as it relates to deciphering code or understanding messages, many of you will perhaps have seen the film Imitation Game, Benedict Cumberbatch, which depicted Cambridge mathematician Alan Turing and his work with British intelligence during World War II as he worked to help decipher that Enigma code that the Nazi army was using to coordinate their airstrikes. And of course, as Turing and his team worked to develop a different way to hear, a different way to interpret these messages that they were intercepting, a great deal of fear was relieved, a substantial military advantage was gained on the Western Front when these messages were able to be rightly understood. Well, we began just last Sunday this new teaching series called After God's Own Heart. looking at the life of David as it's chronicled for us in the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and drawing that title from a description that the Bible itself gives us of David, he was called a man after God's own heart. And one of the main things that I tried to highlight for us in that introductory message was how difficult it can be many times to reconcile that title with David when you consider all of his life, which included some really monumental moral failures and not just his highlight reel. Because, it's incredible just to see the difference between the two. And which led us to the conclusion that at the very least, what the Bible means when it describes David after a man after God's own heart, and what we usually mean when we think of that, they might not be exactly the same thing. Not exactly. And the hope that each one of us can draw from that then is that if being a man and woman after God's own heart has to do primarily much more with the attitude and the orientation of our heart being towards God as consistently as we can, and not epic conquests or living a life of sinless perfection, then that also means that there's hope. There's hope for you. There's hope for me to also be known in this exact same way ourselves. We could be known as those who are after God's own hearts. Now, the first thing that we learned about what that means to be after God's own heart from our passage last Sunday had to do primarily with learning to see like God sees. So looking first to the truth of our relationship with God at a heart level, starting here before trying to enact kind of an external vision of what we believe that should look like. All the different tasks that we think make us look like someone after God's own heart. Starting here, what's really going on at my heart level? What we're going to see in our passage today, and the reason for all that talk about deciphering code and understanding and hearing each other, is that along with learning to see differently, being a man and woman after God's own heart is also about learning to hear differently as well. Learning to hear differently. Now, we'll dig into that a lot more as we get going here, but so you can see for yourself where I'm drawing that from, where I draw that from idea primarily is with contrasting the way Saul and the Israelite soldiers hear Goliath's challenge in verse 11 with the way that David hears it in verse 23. They seem to be very different ways of hearing and different responses as a result of that. And why that matters so much for you and I today in our own lives is because I believe this. How you hear has everything to do with whether or not you remain paralyzed by your fears like Saul and the Israelites, or whether you're unable to overcome them like David was. How you hear is the key element in those things. So in order to help us understand how David learned to hear differently like this, and hopefully how we can develop that same ability in our own lives as well, I want to look at this incredibly well-known story once again with just a single focus. I know Dave Gibbon was very happy about that last week when I had just 1 point. Mark your calendars, it's probably not going to happen again. 1 point sermon once again. The only difference is that today we just need to do a little bit of, I'm calling it pre-work, a little bit of pre-work before we can get into that single focus. And the reason, very simply, is because over the years, this story of David and Goliath, best way I can say it, it's just kind of being hijacked. It's kind of been hijacked, and then it's suffered under some really unhelpful misapplication over the years. And so I think it's important to just clear any remnants of that off the table before we dig in, because it's going to give us the best chance of understanding all the glorious truths that this passage does have to teach us. So the single focus that I want to talk about this morning is developing your hearing. But before we get there, I'm going to spend a little bit of time setting the story straight. So we'll start there, setting the story straight, and then we'll dive right into developing your hearing. Setting the story straight, developing your hearing. So if you closed your Bibles, would you open them again, please, to that passage in 1 Samuel 17. Follow along with me as we continue to learn through the life of David about being after God's own heart, and specifically today, learning to hear differently. Okay, so let's do this pre-work. Let's do this pre-work first of all and talk about setting the story straight. We're going to set the story straight. And for any of you who ever had the experience of someone getting the story wrong about you, you already know how important this is, right? Because if your starting point is wrong, then every interpretation of the facts that follows that is also going to be wrongly skewed, right? Because your starting point is wrong. Like, just for instance, just try one time forgetting to check your rearview mirror and have someone honk at you while your mom or dad are in the car. It doesn't matter how you can be the best driver in the world. What you need now from this day forward is a living rearview mirror who will check for you as you make any turns, because now the interpretation is you don't know how to drive. You don't check your mirror. Let me check it for you. Oh, did you look? That seems to be what the case is. They've got the story wrong because of that. Or a classic example of this from history would be something like the fundamentalist modernist controversy from the early 20th century, where one of the issues on the table there was whether or not the miraculous events in the Bible actually took place, or if they were just kind of, mythical, embellished stories to help communicate true things about God. It's probably not difficult at all to imagine all the devastating implications for faith, the authority of the Bible, not to mention the resurrection of Jesus upon which our whole hope stands if your starting point is that the miraculous is not truly possible. Kind of a big deal. But another example of getting the story wrong, and this relates now directly to this misapplication of the David and Goliath story, is this. It would be starting with the idea that this book, that the Bible, is primarily a book about you and what you should do, and not a book that is about God and what He's done. That's the wrong starting point, that the Bible's about you and not about God and what He's done. Now, some of you are looking at me like, wait, it is? Yeah. Bible's not about you. Bible is a revelation of who God is, what He's like, what He's done in history in order to redeem a fallen humanity back to Himself. Now, there's all kinds of implications for us as a result of that, but the Bible is not written about you. It's written about God. That's where we need to have the starting point. And listen, there's all kinds of problems that develop when you begin with the starting point that the Bible's about you. But as it relates to this classic story of David and Goliath, what that starting point will do is reduce this story to a Tony Robbins workshop about facing up to your fears and standing up to them. That's what this story becomes if that's your starting point. You suddenly become David. You're David, and what you need to do is to learn how to visualize success in your mind so that you can enact that. You can stand up to the Goliaths in your life and overcome them. Which, come on, that sounds so good, right? That sounds really good and inspiring. Yes, I want that. Do you know what the problem with that is? Life. Life is the problem with that. Because again and again, it's going to prove that conclusion wrong. You know why? Because you can't visualize cancer out of your body. You can't visualize your marriage back together, or not losing your job, or not losing your child in the second trimester. You can't, you can visualize those things. You can do it, but you don't have the ability to make those visualizations become reality. It's just imagination. And again, life is just not going to play along with that game. It's not going to play by those rules. No, the only way this story of David and Goliath truly brings any lasting, genuine hope to us is when we begin with acknowledging that this story is not primarily about us, but about God and what He has done in sending Jesus. Amen. That's how we set this story straight. Because when that's where you're starting from, when you start there, what you see is instead in this story an incredible story of rescue. It's a story of rescue where a champion steps out from amongst a helpless, cowering people, unable to rescue themselves, defeats the enemy decisively, and then whose victory is then applied to those on whose behalf he's fought. Does that story sound at all familiar to you? If you're a Christian here today, it should, because that's the message of the gospel, right there. That when you stood cowering, powerless, without any hope before the giant of sin and death, and by the way, that's who we are in the story, okay? If we're anybody in the story, we're Saul and the Israelites over here. That's who we are. That when we stood hopeless, powerless before the enemies of sin and death, God sent a champion, Jesus Christ, the true and better David, who fought on your behalf and whose victory over death now becomes yours through faith in Him. That's what this story is truly pointing to, and why it's so important that we need to set this story straight. Because if you miss that this is not a story about you fighting at all, but about a champion who fights on your behalf, then you get the whole story wrong. And you miss out on the hope that this story actually does offer you when it comes to facing those fears that continue to come, that continue to mock and threaten to destroy you still today. So we need to set that story straight. I hope it's straight enough that we can continue. So understanding this is a story of rescue, a champion who fights on our behalf, we can now move on to this singular focus, developing your hearing. Developing your hearing. And we need to talk about this and understand, well, what it is that we can learn about being after God's own heart ourselves. Because think about it. If this story of David and Goliath, if this is only a story about Jesus' victory over sin and death on our behalf, then it's a great story, but it's nothing more than a story. You see, like, if this is just a well-known story that illustrates something true about God, but it didn't actually happen, that changes it, right? But if this is actually historical narrative that we're reading here, and there actually was a kid named David who really did fight this huge guy named Goliath and defeated him, well, then we can begin to learn and explore who this guy was, how he did face this guy, and learn something about how it is that he was enabled to stand up to this Goliath when a king and his entire army could not. And as I said when we began, I believe the answer to how David was enabled to do that is very simply because David had learned to hear differently than Saul and his army had. And all I want to do for the rest of our time here is just look at where we see that in the passage and then talk about how David was enabled to hear differently so that hopefully by God's grace we might learn to develop our own hearing to hear like this as well. So, if you remember this story, you've got these two armies on either side of the valley. You've got the Philistine army on one side, Saul and the Israelites on the other. And in verse 4 of our passage, this champion, literally in the Hebrew, the man between, steps out from the Philistine line, and then in verses 8 through 10, challenges the armies of Israel to a battle of champions, where the victor, whoever wins that battle, wins the victory on behalf of the whole army. Which, come on, that sounds like a pretty good deal on the surface of it, right? That sounds good. Way less bloodshed. They get to choose whoever they want. It's not as though he's picking the teams. They get to choose whoever they want. It all sounds good until we read the description that we have of Goliath. All of a sudden, it doesn't sound so fair. Verse 4 through 7, he's over 9 feet tall, incredibly strong. His coat of armor, all these weight in shekels, his coat of armor, just the coat part, 125 pounds. That's just the coat. And weapons that make everyone else's weapons look like children's weapons. It's crazy, the size of this guy. And then on top of that, he's also incredibly confident and verbally abusive, which adds a whole new level to his intimidation, doesn't it? Now, what a number of commentators point out about this whole scene up until verse 11 is two things. First of all, while you read of this kind of champion versus champion combat in a lot of Greco-Roman history and literature, you don't read about this anywhere else in the Bible. This was not a form of warfare that Saul and these armies were familiar with at all. So already they're at a disadvantage. They don't even know what the rules are. Like, do we each take turns hitting? They don't know what it is. And then, secondly, nowhere else in the Bible are we given such a detailed description of someone's armor and weapons. Which means what the narrator is doing here is putting incredible emphasis on Goliath's appearance in order to help us just feel just how intimidating he really was to Saul and his armies. And as the story continues, actually, what that does is provides a really strong contrast between Goliath's size and weapons with David's complete lack of any of those things. But what I want you to see in particular, in light of this description, is what we read in verse 11. Look with me there. After Goliath, he comes out, he sets out his challenge and defies, literally insults the armies of Israel. We read this in verse 11. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. I find that to be incredibly interesting, that after all this detailed description of intimidating description of Goliath's formidable size and appearance, we're told that it was hearing the Philistines' words that Saul and all the Israelite army lose heart and become terrified. Now, if you look at verse 12, we kind of switch scenes all of a sudden. We switch from battlefield to Bethlehem. And this is where we learn about the circumstances that lead Jesse to send David into the mix. And honestly, when you read that section, verses 12 through 23, there's nothing that stands out as odd, nothing that's setting up the ear for what's about to come. It's just also normal, which I think, by the way, is it's another indication of why this is very likely a historical account, because in stories they try to foreshadow what's coming. Here it's just this really normal, yeah, I want you to go check on how your brothers are doing, bring them lunch, report back. That's it. That's all that's supposed to happen here. And that's exactly how the story progresses until verse 22, when David arrives at the camp just as they're heading out to form their battle lines. And so David kind of suspends his lunch courier duties for a minute and just runs down to the battle lines to greet his brothers, and probably he wants to see what's going on. He's a kid, right? And he's like, I want to see what it looks like. He runs down to the battle lines with them. But when you get to the end of verse 23, although it's presented in just this kind of throwaway, everyday, inconspicuous, routine manner possible, when Goliath comes out to shout his usual defiance, which he's been doing for the last 40 days, we're told very simply this: and David heard it. No commentary, just, and David heard it. So now that sets up the contrast, right? Okay? We've clearly seen how Saul and the Israelite army responded to hearing Goliath's words. How will David hear them? Well, when you begin to look at the questions that David starts to ask of the soldiers around him when he hears Goliath's words, it's a pretty clear indication of how he's hearing them. Look at verse 26. David starts saying, well, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? I think that's a pretty clear indication of how he's hearing it. Now, Saul gets word. He hears that David is saying stuff like this. He's talking all this smack and throwing shade on Goliath. He's like, well, now, who's this guy? Who's this? Because clearly what that means is nobody else is responding that way. Not even Saul. They're all terrified. David's response is the only one different. So he's like, bring that guy in. I need to see who this is. And then we remove all doubt as to how David was hearing Goliath's words when he says in verse 32, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And so the question we need to answer, now that we've clearly seen those two different ways of hearing, is how in the world was David able to respond to hearing Goliath's threats like this when everyone else is paralyzed with fear after hearing them? How? Well, as I've said, I believe the answer is that he just learned to hear differently, which I need you to hear me saying, this isn't at all to suggest that David isn't still afraid. Don't hear at all David being like, I got this, whatever. He still feels fear. Of course he does. There is still fear involved in what's going on. Only that because he's enabled to hear differently, he's enabled to understand Goliath's threats in a way that don't paralyze him with fear. He's still able to keep moving forward in spite of it. And what I want to show you from our passage now are two ways that I believe David was enabled to hear like that, with the hope that we can develop our hearing like this as well. So the first way David is enabled to hear differently, we see in verses 34 to 37. We'll state it this way. David hears the threats of Goliath differently, first of all, by recalling the faithfulness of God to him in the past. That's the first way he does this. So after David tells Saul that he will fight Goliath, verse 33 there, Saul responds by basically saying, no, you won't. There's no way you'll be able to fight him. He's not just bigger than you, he's decades more experienced than you, which is so ironic and sad, isn't it? How many of you already know that voices that speak fear and intimidation don't just come from the enemy, they also come from people that are supposed to be on your team? Experienced that before? And yet, even still, look at David's response, verse 34. Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. Now listen, 37 is so key. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So you see what David is doing there. He's enabled to hear Goliath's words differently because it's almost like he hears them through a filter. The threats of Goliath come through a filter of all the previous examples of when God has delivered David in the past. So now, just as hearing a lion's roar no longer makes David run for cover, neither does the barking of this giant. He hears it differently now. This is just the usual defiance. He's like, yeah, that's what these guys sound like. That's what they sound like when they're trying to intimidate us. Yep. He hears it differently, you see. Second way David's enabled to hear differently is verses 45 through 47. And we'll state it this way. David hears the threats of Goliath differently because his trust is not in his own ability and power to overcome Goliath, but in the Lord's. And you clearly hear this on the battlefield. David's response to Goliath's threats when he says this to him, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head today. I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For this battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Do you hear anything in David's response there that sounds like he believes it's his own skills and ability that are going to overcome the giant? What does he keep saying? That God's going to do that. He's going to hand you over to us. So David's been able to hear Goliath's words differently because he knows that every victory he's ever had against any foe that's tried to threaten his life hasn't come through his own skill, hasn't come through his own ability or power at all, but through the power of the God of Israel fighting on his behalf. See, even David knew this story wasn't about him. It's about a God who fights on our behalf. That's what he's trusting in, and that's why he can hear the threats differently. And as you think about whatever fear it is that you're facing today in your own life, maybe it's a fear that you've been facing for years now. How different might those fearful giants look for you if you were enabled to hear their terrifying threats differently like this? What would they look like if you could hear like this? How might those present threats of financial uncertainty, an overwhelming exam schedule, health limitations, all the things that scream to you, you can't do it, you're never going to make it, there's no way you can stand up against this giant and win. How might they sound differently if we heard those threats first, if they first had to pass through a filter of God's faithfulness to deliver you again and again and again and again? I said this before. What if Jesus didn't have to start at zero every time a new Goliath came out onto the battlefield to face you? How different would these threats sound? Now listen, I'm not going to say that removes fear entirely, but I bet beginning with God's faithfulness to you, when these threats come, which sure turn down the volume a lot when they do come. Or how might all those threats from without, and we also know from within, that say to you, you know what, you're too stained, too broken, too screwed up for God to ever accept someone like you. Your marriage is way too far gone to ever be restored. That addiction far too strong for you to ever come. You know what, you are those things that were done to you all those years ago. It's always going to be like this. How differently might those threats sound if we were to hear them like they were spoken to the one who fights on your behalf, the Lord Almighty, instead of you? And maybe you say, well, what are you talking about? Those threats aren't being spoken against God. They're being spoken to me. I'm the one who's being threatened. Are you? That's the beauty of this. Don't you see? A threat spoken against a child of God is a threat spoken against the Lord. Come on, anyone in here, you got kids you care about? Aren't you going to respond exactly the same way? Someone starts threatening your child, you're going to be like, stand up for yourself. No, you're going to step in there and be like, excuse me? Now this conversation is between us, right? Like, of course, a threat spoken against a child is a threat spoken against God. That's exactly what you see in the text, isn't it? Goliath, he's uttering his threats against the armies of Israel, but when David shows up, he says, actually, this battle is the Lord's. He's the one actually you're fighting against now, not me. It's God's battle. The threats are spoken against him. You see this same thing centuries later in the prayers of the apostles in the book of Acts, who apparently had also learned to hear differently, when they were threatened with beatings, floggings, and imprisonment for speaking in the name of Jesus, when they pray this, and now, Lord, look on their threats. You look on the threats, and grant your servants to continue to speak your word with all boldness, while you stretch out your hand to heal and perform miraculous signs and wonders through the name of your holy servant Jesus. They heard differently. They said, actually, these threats are against you. You look on them. You deal with them. And we're just going to continue to be faithful to what you've called us to do. I know that many of you here today are facing threats of some terrifying giants that keep you paralyzed, standing on the sidelines of the battlefield, not into life. I know that. I hope you see more clearly now why it was so important that we start with setting this story straight before we looked at what the story does have to teach us. Because many of you here, just like me, we've already tried that whole just face up to your giants, visualize success. We've tried that. And now we bear the wounds of that misapplication of the story, which only left us even more fearful than before. And man, this was exactly me. This is exactly me for years of my life as I faced the giants of approval and acceptance from others. Those are the giants I faced, and the more I tried to stand up to them and face my giants, visualize a reality where I could just be myself and be liked by people, the more those fears were just confirmed. Oh, wow, okay, I thought I could share, and no, I'm not accepted. My fears were just more deeply ingrained after that when I tried to stand up to my giants on my own, which eventually just led me to trade in my hope of acceptance for just basically masks and deception. I just traded in believing, you know what, it's always going to be like this, and so at least it's good for someone to love a false version of me than not at all. I lived under that fear for years of my life, and it wasn't until one day by God's grace, and then over time, much more time by God's grace, I slowly began to look not on my own strength and ability to face those giants, but to Jesus' unlimited strength and ability. It enabled me to begin to hear those threats differently, as not directed first at me, but at the one who fights on my behalf, who's given me evidence after evidence of his faithfulness and of his unconditional acceptance of me. You have that in me. So that today, now, I still hear those threats every day. I still hear them all the time. They haven't gone away. I just hear them differently now. They don't paralyze me anymore like they used to. And you see, that's where the true hope of this story is. That's where it's found. It's how we can truly learn to overcome giants of fear that continue to face us and begin to learn to hear their threats differently, not in trying to be courageous like David. No. You're going to get killed if you try to be courageous like David. But in looking to Jesus, the champion who stepped forward and won the greatest victory over your greatest foe, and who continues to fight giants still today on behalf of all who are his. Thanks be to God. Amen.